Can we create a more robust, ethical, and transparent artificial intelligence that we can trust and understand? Could AI make law more accessible? And do we really want machine-assisted legal services? Can AI produce genuine transformations within the policy cycle? And what this means for local governments delivering public services? If we see an end to the prevention of human rights, does this justify influencing election results with the help of new technologies? These are some of the questions we invite you to think through with our stellar lineup of panelists. Hello and welcome to AI for Democracy. My name is Marton Ribary, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Surrey School of Law and a member of Surrey's Law and Technology Hub. Around this virtual roundtable, I have with me Professor Amelia Hetfield. Please wave to the camera. Professor Amelia Hetfield, Head of the Department of Politics at Surrey and Chair in European International Affairs. Dr. Alex Leveringhouse, Lecturer in Political Theory in the Department of Politics and the Co-Director of Surrey's Centre for International Intervention. Mr. Miklos Orbán, co-founder of OPL, a full-scale regional law firm with possibly the widest range of innovative machine-assisted legal services in Central Europe. Dr. Adam Weiner, Associate Professor in the School of Law and Department of Computer Science at Swansea University, where he lectures and conducts research on artificial intelligence and law. Special thanks due to Mr. Andrea Priorelli. Wave to the camera, Andrea Priorelli, a postgraduate researcher at the Surrey's School of Law, who overlooks the smooth running of today's event and manages the questions and answers section. Please note that the event is being recorded. We start today's discussion with a short icebreaker presentations by our panelists. Just a week after the eventful US presidential elections, I think it's appropriate to start with Alex Leveringhouse, who will talk about technology's role in influencing and maintaining democratic processes in general and elections in particular. He is followed by Amelia Hetfield, who will say a few sentences about technology's role in the policy lifecycle, illustrated with real-life examples. Adam Weiner will follow on Amelia's topic, as he will speak about policy consultation from the perspective of the technologist, with a focus on the techniques used. This initial round of icebreakers is concluded by Miklos Orbán, who takes the perspective of the practicing lawyer, as he will say a few sentences about advising policymakers and clients on the use of technology. I encourage you to ask your questions by using the Q&A function in the bottom of the Zoom window. If you wish, you may also request to share voice, video, and screen for your questions. While we are collecting those questions, the panel will address some challenges and opportunities to technology is expected to bring. But for now, we shall start with the icebreaker, short icebreaker presentations, starting with Alex. Alex, it's you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Marton, for organizing this, and thanks for the people who've turned up to this. It would be great if we could have had sort of a proper face-to-face event, but I think cyberspace will have to do for now. So I just want to very briefly talk about the role of new technologies in preventing human rights violations. I should probably say that this is sort of an emerging research stream within the University of Surrey, within a network we're currently trying to get underway on the impact of algorithms and AI on democratic societies. So rough ideas I'm going to sketch fall under this network. Now, my primary interest was and still is the issue of military intervention, and especially whether military force should sometimes be used in order to prevent human rights abuses. And that's, of course, a big discussion from the 1990s and also the early 2000s, if you think of Bosnia, if you think of Kosovo, the Rwandan genocide, and so on. However, the question is whether new technologies here are a new opportunity for us to do something about human rights abuses without necessarily using military force and being very invasive in other societies. And the question here is whether you can be more proactive in using new technologies in order to prevent human rights abuses, in particular by influencing election outcomes. And I guess the idea is that sometimes in elections, in democratic systems, and semi-democratic systems, parties might be standing for elections which advocate policies that might lead to human rights violations. So what should you do? Well, rather than wait until those parties get into power and those human rights violations materialize, you should be proactive and you should try to change the election outcome. And you can certainly see how emerging technologies, data collection, bots, social media, and all that stuff could be used for those sorts of purposes. Now, it seems to me that there are really two ways of influencing an election. So the first way is fairly straightforward, and that's simply voter suppression. You want to prevent people from going to the polls and casting their votes in the first place. And it seems to me that, you know, some database technologies, AI, algorithms, and so on could be useful here. So you could, for example, use those technologies to destroy voter records, for example, via a sophisticated computer virus. For sort of having talked to some experts, that's actually relatively rare. So those are more sort of science fictionist scenarios where probably AI and algorithms, bots, and so on might be more useful, might be in giving out deceptive misinformation. So we know, for example, that weather, news about the weather can affect turnout in elections. If the weather is very bad, people are unlikely to go to the polls because they don't want to get drenched in rain. So you could very well, you know, before such an election, imagine, you know, bots pushing out a message on social media that the weather would be very, very bad. As a result, you know, people don't go to vote. The other idea is that you can affect an election by really changing people's minds, sort of hearts and minds operations, changing people's opinions. No, you don't really want to vote for those people who might really implement terrible human rights abusing policies. So you try to change people's minds. And, you know, you can do this overtly. For example, President Obama in 2016 coming out and saying, don't vote for Brexit, don't do it, it's a bad idea. It's a very overt way of doing it, but you could also do this covertly. So you could, for example, use, you know, counter propaganda on social media. You could, for example, collect loads of data about users in a specific state, and you could then start to specifically target those users and give them messages that should persuade them not to vote for that terrible party that's going to implement human rights abusing policies. So those would be just some of the ways in which you could use technologies to influence election outcomes. Now, what is the issue here? So I just want to outline sort of 3 or 4 or 5 very, very quick points, and then I'm done. So one of the issues surely is deception here. You know, should you deceive people in the first place? You know, should they tell them the weather is bad or the queues at the polling stations are very, very long today, so don't go out because it will be a drag? Should you deceive people? So that's one of the big questions that arises here. One of the other questions is, of course, fairly straightforward. You know, if regimes are already on the brink of bringing, or if political systems are already on the brink of bringing into power parties that might enact human rights abusing policies, well, you know, what are the chances that they're going to respect an election result, even if you sway the election via new technologies? We might also ask whether we would be really comfortable with a foreign state collecting loads of data about users in another state and using that data, even if it's for the good purpose of preventing human rights abuses, in order to hack an election. So that might be very questionable indeed. One of the other big questions also pertains to the issue of other states. So you might be doing it and you might be using those technologies in order to influence elections, but of course your competitors might do the same. Really with not very benign intentions, probably. So once the cat's out the bag, are we really confident that it will be sort of kept in ways that would be used conducive to certain good ends? And then lastly, it seems to me if those technologies would be used in order to hack elections or to influence election outcomes, then a lot of this will be covert. Whereas public accountability, at least with these bigger interventions that we saw in the 1990s or the 2000s, there was a degree of public accountability. There was a degree of public scrutiny. We knew, you know, what was going on. That might be far harder to ascertain with some of these other technologies or digital technologies that could be used in order to hack elections. So in sum, an interesting argument. We don't want to intervene necessarily. Can we use softer means? Can we use new technologies to influence election outcomes, for a noble cause, the protection of human rights? But, there are all sorts of strings attached. And it seems to me there are all sorts of very weighty normative issues that require clarification. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Now I give the floor to Emilia, who will speak about the policy life cycle and the relation to the technology.
Thank you, Martin. And thanks so much for organizing this event. This, I think, as Alex said, follows on from an emerging and very exciting theme across the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and that is the role of AI and sort of data-driven policy making at any rate. So from politics, obviously, and from political philosophy, we're very interested in the way in which it interacts with the policy cycle and with things like democracy. And I think Alex has already raised some of the interesting and real dilemmas that arise with potential shortcuts, if you like, through the democratic and electoral processes. Certainly, I think in the last couple of years, we have seen immense technological advances in the various fields of AI and machine learning together, both of which crucially rely on data and the use of that data. And to my mind, our entire society is hugely data-driven. What I'm interested in is the role of democracy itself and certain sort of aspects of democracy, including, for example, citizenship and the making of public policy, all, I think, now very heavily reliant on data. I think it's difficult to imagine a world without it. Without data, I don't think the modern state, or particularly not a modern market economy, would be able to function. So AI is not anymore solely the domain of technologists. It's our domain now, and it's a very powerful tool, I think, in the hands of policymakers and the media, as we've seen, as well as industry, and of course the citizens themselves. So key questions, to my mind, arise with regards to the development of AI for the practice of democracy, and I think the theory, if you like, of public policy analysis. So Alex has already asked, with regards to the impact of electoral structures, and I think I could add to that. So to what extent should polling agencies and political parties, mindful of the American election, be allowed to access large data sets in order to model voting intentions? Should we be trying to use AI to prevent political radicalization? Should we be working with AI more extensively in terms of the security agencies? Should we allow security agencies to use sophisticated machine learning to analyze social media accounts, for example? So there's always these questions that start with to what extent, if any, for example, can the democratic state become digitized? And in doing so, does this actually make it more accountable and more efficient, or less transparent and less representative of the overall needs, particularly the micro needs of communities as well? And of course, from political science, who's in charge? Who watches the watchers? Who oversees the aggregation and the use, not just of these data sets, but the myriad ways in which AI is put into practice in this respect? So I think the social and political sciences have an important role to play in answering these specific questions. I think my particular interest is, how do you make healthy public policy when you've got AI on the scene? So what is the role, if you like, of data-driven policy making? I think there are areas in which we've already seen some use. I think the idea of beginning to use AI in the courts, for example, to work through the enormous backlog and to try to find a quicker, more efficient way to pass generic sentences against a variety of civil and potentially criminal breaches is one area where it may work, although I think there's some serious questions overhanging it. I think, interestingly, and not everybody, I think, is au fait with this, that the sheer use by local councils in England in terms of the role of AI. So 1 in 3 councils use computer algorithms to help make decisions about benefit claims and other welfare issues. And some, I think, in some sense, probably have a clear idea as to how and why. And yet on the other side, you have a great deal of evidence suggesting that some of these systems and some of the decisions made are unreliable. So companies using credit rating businesses, and particularly those using a sort of outsourcing specialists like Capita, for example, data mining firms, are sort of selling off-the-shelf machine learning packages to local authorities, who right now, of course, are under tremendous pressure to save money. They were under the age of austerity, and they certainly are under the age of COVID. But if you have a good look at it, of the 408 councils, 140 have invested in these software contracts, which themselves are not necessarily that cheap. They run into millions of pounds. And the question is, is this a good thing? Is this an efficient use of AI as a sort of new social philosophy? I think to some extent, maybe yes, the systems are being deployed probably to provide a degree of automated guidance on things like benefit claims, hopefully try to reduce things like child abuse and allocate school places. But there are genuine concerns, and I think it's something we need to talk about, hopefully this evening, about privacy, about data security, about the ability of council officials to understand how some of these systems work, and the difficulty for citizens themselves in challenging automated decisions. So I think there's very real issues here. I'll just highlight one or two points before I hand over to the next speaker. And that, of course, I think is the distinction between regulating AI in society, which to me is a sort of much more top-down issue, and then data-driven policy making on the basis of specific communities, which I think is a rather more bottom-up kind of dynamic. So in terms of AI in society, and perhaps AI as a catalyst for democracy, in many ways, again, we are beginning to see AI as business as usual. So it covers areas of privacy, IP law, and competition. But I think what's a game changer is perhaps as I mentioned before, new fields of law being added and regularized, if you like, using AI. But in terms of policy making that responds to the local particularisms of councils and communities, that's much more difficult. You've got two things going on. You've got the decision making and on the basis of data-driven algorithms, which tends to be rather more linear. And then you've got the policy cycle, which is itself a cycle, it's a circle. And that is entirely based on learning through feedback loops. So formulating, implementing, evaluating, and sort of recalibrating. So there's slightly different geometries, if you like, in terms of how those two systems work. And I think what's a game changer from this bottom-up perspective is that the right data is not always in the right hands. The relevant data is not necessarily in the hands of public authorities. And also, I think the rush for efficiency and the rush for speed may interrupt that sort of regularized policy cycle, may cut that policy planning away from the cycle. And in doing so, possibly undermine our ability to see political accountability be as clear as it possibly could be. So those are just some ideas that we're working with and getting our head around in the politics department. Alex, I think, has touched on areas where we overlap, but I think the idea of looking at AI's way of opening these questions is absolutely fascinating. So Martin, I'll end there and hand on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. And it's now to Adam, who will speak about a very similar topic from the perspective of the technologist.
Well, I'll put up some slides here. It's always fantastic to follow a very clear and interesting point of view about the relationship between AI and policymaking. So I want to talk about a different perspective on how this kind of work might be done. And there's a kind of underlying general point that I want to make, which partly addresses Amelia and also, the other speakers on the panel. And I want to say, first of all, this is sort of a contrast. It's not a personal point of view about things. There is a very general idea that AI is equivalent to machine learning and data processing. This has been going on for some years now. I'm largely from computer science background and my field is in AI. This is really a misconception about what artificial intelligence is about. Machine learning is a very huge and very important area within artificial intelligence. It has always been there, and it's been making a lot of contributions, and data analysis is making huge contributions. But what is missing, which is what I'll get to, what is missing is a discussion also of what's called knowledge representation and reasoning, where you're representing the knowledge that people have in a computer system and reasoning, for instance, at large scale with this. These two areas about knowledge representation and reasoning and machine learning, they are not completely antagonistic. They're not a complete opposites, right? They can be blended, and a lot of people are working in this area, but it is really very important to impress on people in general, especially those who are not in computer science, that data and machine learning is not the whole story. And there's a great deal that's going on in the knowledge representation and reasoning area. Okay, that's sort of my general comment about that, because I think I need to push a little bit of the antidote to what I hear going on in general, and I'm quite confident about doing that. So what I want to talk about very briefly with you here is some work that I did some years ago about a structured consultation tool for policymaking, and it is really founded in an approach to knowledge representation and reasoning. I still very much believe that this kind of work is very valuable and has huge potential as an auxiliary, as an additional tool to other kinds of things that are going on in policymaking. General kind of thing about deliberation and contradiction. So we know that for policymaking and democracy, the deliberation is absolutely fundamental, right? And we know that deliberation is a process of considering alternative positions about how to solve some problem, and it's essentially intended to be a rational process, at least, you know, to a greater extent, rather than simply a bullying or publicity process, as we've heard in the US elections, for example. You are supposed to state alternative positions, pro and con. You are supposed to give justifications of your positions, etc. And there clearly should be statements of, you know, the pro and con means that there are incompatibilities between the positions, right? There are contradictions between the two positions that are being stated. The problem for AI is that when you get to contradiction and incompatibilities, classical logic has significant problems in continuing to reason. So this is a general kind of problem, and we've had to work for some years on how to address this matter of incompatibility or contradiction, and now we have very good solutions for this. And just as a little example, you know, you might have some policy proposal like smoking should be banned in the pubs, and there's some justification for the proposal. It would lead, you know, to a decrease in health costs and better for the environment, and somebody else comes back at you and says, well, you know, that proposal might infringe on civil rights and ruin pub culture, these kinds of things, right? So the question here is, how can we capture people's different points of view, but not just capture these simple oppositions, but capture also the details of their justifications, as well as offer people a view into the alternatives that are available in terms of the reasoning process. So we want to be able to analyze, structure, and extract these deliberations, particularly from the abundance of information. Now, one of the things that Amelia pointed out is the policymaking cycle. One approach that happens, other than, you know, democratic voting, is that a government will issue a consultation paper with a series of questions. Those are circulated amongst the stakeholders, who then might write back with a 1-page to 100-page document outlining their answers to these documents. The government or the consulting body will then take those documents and do some analysis to kind of try to distill out the opinions. This is not a matter, this is big data, but it's not amenable to machine learning, because the complexity and richness and fine-grainedness of the data is prohibitive to machine learning processes, okay? So the question is, how can we kind of dig into these kinds of distributed information sources? And this is fundamentally a knowledge extraction and a knowledge engineering kind of task. There was a tool that we had some years ago that's still somewhat live, but it needs to be brought back, where we could systematically explore a policy proposal, its justifications, its critiques in order to essentially survey a population for some very fine-grained opinions towards a specific policy. And for this, we use structured argumentation, which is also allied with a formal analysis of a treatment of arguments and contradiction that gets around this whole kind of interaction. So just the last slide on this, and then some other information if people wanted it. But the consultation tool structures the information using what's known as argumentation schemes. These are normative patterns of reasoning that people have. They're also defeasible. And in effect, they can create complex decision trees, and they can structure textual information. They present information in a highly structured manner to the audience to survey them in a very fine-grained way, asks critical questions, can visualize the results, and then these results can be input to an argumentation calculator that is in fact Leibniz's dream from some time ago about being able to sit together, to present one's arguments and then to calculate. And that's the intention of these kinds of tools. The rest of this presentation, which I could show people, is screenshots of the demo of this project, but I'll leave that aside and let the next speaker take over. Thanks very much. And I will hand back control to Martin. Thank you.
So finally, we conclude this round of icebreakers from the perspective of the practicing lawyer, Miklos.
Thank you all, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about from my perspective. Let me emphasize, I'm not from the academia. I'm a practicing consultant and also a lawyer at the same time, so I have a different perspective. I mean, I've been advising clients, be it governmental entities, or be it big companies, for a really long time about technology and the use of AI in legal fields. And my experience has been that there are two extremes, and there's almost nothing in between. On one hand, you have all the people who believe that whatever AI generates is like a line from the Bible, so you have to follow. And the other end is that completely underestimates the importance of AI and don't really get what AI is capable of. And my experience tells me that both of these extremes need a lot of education. Let me start with the first one. Those people who believe that whatever score a model gives you it has to be followed full stop. That comes from the US. Almost every US state at the moment, there are algorithms helping judges in sentences as well as in parole hearings. And surprisingly to me, even though it has been proved many, many times that these algorithms are anything but really reliable, over 80% of the judges follow the scoring system in a very simple-minded manner. I'm giving you an example, is that if you are a judge in the US and you're given a computer-generated score of the likelihood of a person reoffending with a number, let's say 62%, then judges tend to say that it's over 50. So I have to say there's a higher likelihood of he's going to be reoffending. So bail denied. This is a good example of people don't understanding what computational statistics is about. So they don't really understand what 62% may mean. It doesn't mean that that very person is going to reoffend. It should work as like a consultant is telling me that you have a little bit higher chance of him reoffending, but you still have to know the bits and details of why the algorithm came to that conclusion. And I usually give the analogy from politics to people. You remember from 2016, again, US elections, when Trump had maybe, I think, if I can recall correctly, according to most of the national pollsters, had 11% likelihood of winning the elections. And despite all the odds, he won the elections in 2016. And then people said that, all the models were wrong. And this is exactly the kind of misunderstanding of the whole system. This is computational statistics. If you have 11% of likelihood of winning the election, it doesn't mean you're not going to win the election. It just means that it's much more probable than you lose. What happened? He won. It didn't mean that the whole system was wrong. And I think this is exactly what I have been coming across very, very often when I'm advising clients, is that very little understanding of the math, statistics, and even data science you need in order to understand what this is about. On the other extreme, what I can see is when people downplaying AI, when they say that this is not gonna replace any lawyers, which is probably true, but at the same time, law is a complex system. It is really hard to understand, really hard to digest. There's a huge amount of regulation, change way too often. It's almost impossible even for humans, us practicing lawyers, to keep track of the changes. So it is already an access to justice question. And if AI is good in something, this is exactly for finding the relevant laws, translating into maybe simple language, and provide tools for people to enforce such laws. So downplaying AI is as big a problem as elevating AI to the level of gods and believing that it's going to solve all our problems. I think what we need at the moment, I usually use the analogies of what happened to me a couple of years ago when I renovated my kitchen. It's the guy from the municipality came over and he said that if you change this wall, then it has to be, 35 minutes fireproof. And I felt that, this is 100 or 150 years of experience and heritage of construction and construction regulation, at least 100 years. This is where if you renovate your house, then you got rules like that, and people know this already. This is exactly what we need to see in AI. We don't have that. We don't have that kind of 100 years of experience, how to make it more transparent, how to make it more reliable. But at the same time, when people complain about, humans versus AI, and that they say that, the problem with AI, it's a black box, I usually say that humans are black boxes, judges are black boxes. I don't know how they come to the conclusion. I've been going to court for 20 years. And one thing I can tell you is I have no clue how they sometimes, come to a conclusion on something. And, algorithms, complicated algorithms have like 100 or 200 data points where if you talk to a judge, he may have, or she may have 5 to 10 data points, in fact, based on which he's going to make a decision. So it is not a black or white question. And what I've been doing, and that's been a big challenge for me in the last 5 to 10 years, is trying to educate people how to use it in a very intelligent way, how to basically understand the math and the numbers behind the scoring, whatever AI is doing. And it's not been an easy exercise. That's back to you, Marton.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the panelists for the icebreakers. Now it's the time for our attendees to ask questions. Please use the Q&A to type your questions. And if you want to speak up instead of typing, you can request that in the same place. And while you type those questions in the Q&A, which will be managed by Andrea, I have a few questions prepared for the panel to discuss today. And I pick possibly this one because it generated a lively discussion in a previous meeting that we had between us, which goes like this. What practical challenges have you faced in your work when applying technology to real-life data? So, putting the theory aside, what happens when we try to use technology to real-life data? Who wants to start? I wonder. We had a lively discussion. Maybe Adam. I thought that you would be the likely candidate to start. Yeah.
So, to my mind, analyzing language and extracting meaning into a form that can be processed is a very gigantic hurdle. And particularly when we come to legal information or policies, this is a very big problem. And it's one thing to address some aspects of this using statistical data, machine learning approaches. The problem is that if you look at a piece of law closely, piece of legislation, case law, regulations, it's very fine-grained, very, very highly structured. Patterns recur somewhat, but it's not as if the drafters of case law, of case decisions and legislation enjoy redundancy, right? They avoid redundancy. So I think the language end of the stick here has to really be faced one day. And it's not even a matter of scale of data. It's a matter of really coming to grips with what language is about and how language communicates meaning, and structuring that in a way that machines can start to process.
I know for certain that Miklos also has a strong view about data. So I wonder whether you want to add a few words about that.
It's not that strong. It's just my experience telling me that it's much harder than people believe. A law as a data set is a complicated thing. And at the moment, we're in the middle of a project where we scoring the complexity of legal language in 5 different countries, and even collecting representative samples, it's already a challenge. So finding the right one, it's finding, it's just, it has to be, first of all, if you want to say something about the complexity of something, the data set you are analyzing has to be representative, because we don't have the capacity to analyze all the laws of 5 different jurisdictions. Just in the UK, roughly 50 million pages of law is currently applicable. Same applies to Spain, and we're analyzing roughly, similar jurisdictions with old traditions in law. So that would be way too much, in my opinion, at least for us at the scale we're running projects. And even finding the law and then getting rid of tiny little things like titles, which can be really misleading, and then make the comparison with the right data set. That's already a very, very challenging exercise. So we usually have this saying that everybody uses in AI is garbage in, garbage out. If your data set is not perfect, whatever you get out of the data set will never be better than the data set itself. So I think the training data set is absolutely critical to have. All the problems what we face is based on the data we collect. And it's not an easy thing to collect in law, easily digestible, computer readable data sets. It's anything but easy. Sure.
Now turning to Emilia and Alex, what is the nature of the data that you use for your research?
Alex, I'm at this point, I don't know, maybe he and I have sort of the same answer. We're kind of more second order than first order, if I can put it at this point. So we tend to be in receipt of, the trends that speak to some of the ways in which the data itself is being used. So it's sort of real-time policy adaptation, if you like. But I'm not skilled enough, I think, to be able to be able to read the data sets themselves beyond basic applications like to an election or various polls and that sort of thing. But Alex, I think, has maybe a little bit more experience in this. I don't know, Alex, if you were going to talk about the bots of hate in a sort of a practical experience, or
yeah, absolutely,
kind of a fun one.
Yeah, again, I'm not a technologist. I train as a philosopher, and I mostly work on normative ethics. But this pertains probably to some earlier research that I did on autonomous weapon systems and killer robots. And I guess, things like machine vision, machine perception, and so on, also very broadly speaking, fall under AI research. And I guess here the big question was, if you think about a robot, for example, that's programmed with a particular military mission, whether such machine could really successfully distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant. which is under international law, really. I mean, one of the obligations that belligerent parties have under international humanitarian law. Now, it's true that you can program a machine to distinguish between a human and a non-human. So if you think about something like the Samsung Sentry robot, for example, that's being used in the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea, that is fairly good. You know, that machine is fairly good at distinguishing between a human and a non-human entity, for example, an animal or, you know, something else. When it comes to this kind of qualitative judgment as to whether someone poses a threat and should be classified as a combatant, or whether someone should be a non-combatant, there's sort of a qualitative element here, a qualitative judgment to be made that seems to be incredibly hard in a way to represent in data and to, you know, let a machine learn or program a machine so that it could comply with this particular legal obligation. I mean, I haven't seen really any successful attempt of doing so. I mean, that judgment is very hard to make for humans in the first place, but, you know, I can't really see with all the data in the world, machine learning, whatever in the world, that this could ever be successfully made by a machine.
Thank you, Alex. We have a couple of questions now in the Q&A. Please keep putting those questions in the Q&A box. Andrea will pick one and ask the panelists to respond to it.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. And I will pick the question by Atay, because I think it's very connected to what has been said in the last few seconds. So are there, to your mind, certain decisions that essentially demand human agency? Or in other words, are there certain issues or formal conditions on the limits of decision-making? Yes, Adam?
It's a good question. I'll use the answer to this also to sort of touch on something that Miklos mentioned. I think one good example of this is something about the death penalty in the United States. And I think it also connects the issue of large data sets and machine learning with the purposes to which legal reasoning is put. So just imagine a hypothetical case where you've got a million death penalty cases in the United States. 50% of those are for, you know, guilty, 50% of those are for innocent. We apply the absolute best machine learning algorithm that we've got. The algorithm results in a model that gives absolutely perfect results, right? For every case that's originally conviction, it's the machine learning algorithm outputs a conviction. For every one that's an exoneration, it outputs an exoneration. The question there is not whether or not we have a perfect data set. It's not whether or not we have a perfect algorithm to give us perfect results. This is a thought experiment, right? The question is are the results appropriate to the task, even if it works perfectly? And the answer, if you know something about the legal system, is no. Because the task of the decisions is also not just to determine guilt or innocence, but the task is also to provide in the legal system a basis for legal appeals, which occur very often. And for legal appeals, what you really need is very detailed, fine-grained information based in the text about why the decision was made as it was. What were the procedures? What was the evidence? Was there any evidence of witness tampering, et cetera, et cetera? That's the way that lawyers reason in detail with the texts. So this is an example where I don't think that, you know, machine learning and statistical approaches really can conquer things. I think that there's huge, it indicates a huge space where human reasoning needs to be integrated into the overall process. So it's an example, it's a bit of a contrary to the machine learning approach, and it also addresses this thing about what's the human role in ongoing legal reasoning, even if we do this with automated support.
Yes, Miklos, please.
I just add to this because perfectly I'm on the same side as Alex, because I think it was a very important point what he just said. I would add that, I mean, if you take law, I think one of the most important feature of law, especially the actual the real law, which is being enforced, which is in front of the court and authorities, is involvement of the law, is the development of the law. Whenever you use a machine learning algorithm, it is trained on a historical data set. And what you can't really predict is how people want something to be changed. If you train a data set based on the 1960s or 50s cases, then it's going to be easily very biased, racially biased, gender biased, and a lot of things like that. And the evolvement of law over the last 20, 30, 40 years have not been, it can be mirrored easily in an exercise where you use AI. And the problem is when when you use AI for making sentences, when making calls, important judgmental calls, the problem is it's based on historical data. So it's you kind of freeze you freeze the current situation, and you don't give any chance of evolvement of the law and development of society, which is, I think, a very important role of the law of lawyers and courts.
Does anyone else want to add something, or we skip to the next question?
I think Alex has something to add on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back very briefly to what I was saying about weapon systems. I mean, it seems really, when it comes to targeting, especially intentional targeting of human individuals, that there is really human judgment required. Now, you could still imagine, I think, autonomous weapons that could be reliably programmed to hit particular targets that are very easily identifiable via a particular signature. For example, an incoming missile that will have a certain heat signature, a certain speed, and so on. That seems to me can be done. But really, when it comes to this fine-grained distinction between combatants and non-combatants, then we're really looking at human judgments. Humans are, usually very, very bad at making this kind of distinction. But it seems to me that machines are going to be much worse.
Okay, we shall now pass to the question by Fiona Weinstein. Do you think, well, it's actually three questions. Do you think that AI would be able to contribute to building democratic systems in developing countries? First one. Who will administer and oversee these systems, international, national organizations, or governments? And would you be concerned AI would be used more to consolidate power for possible autocrats than for building democracy?
Martin, I'll jump in on that one, if I may. That's a very good question. I think the use of AI to look at the sort of baselines with regards to aid distribution, which itself is riddled with complexities in terms of the specific needs of a country, macroeconomic needs, microeconomic needs, food security-based needs, electrification needs, et cetera, et cetera. I perhaps I'm the usual optimist, but I do feel that I think replacing long-term policy planning with more real-time policy adaptation boosted by smart algorithms seems the way to go. But I know how complicated that is just to say it. I'd like to think that aspects of aid can work to target aspects in developing countries, as long as we continue to think of development as effectively poverty reduction and the alleviation of want from a very basic standpoint. Equally, giving an aid has already really fallen afoul of how difficult it is to make sure that money goes, into the right pockets and not into the wrong pockets. So it tends to be shadowed by knee-jerk reactions that 9/10 of aid goes into sort of corrupt coffers. Now, in many ways, that's not true. I think you can have routine and structured oversight, and AI twinned with regulatory modes to ensure this, I think, can probably work for the best. But again, it's who sets this up. It's the scrutiny of the regulations, if you like. Again, what we would say, who watches the watchers is the questions there. So I think you've got a number of issues. You've got a sort of territorial scale of policy question. I think this is going to be increasingly less national. It's going to be supranational. I know that's probably not a popular thing to say, but in terms of regulatory frameworks, those are by default going to be regional. And if you're applying them to developing countries, they tend to be in neighborhoods that you could also classify as regional as well. I also, and I'll just try to finish up with this, policies I think will be less about sort of individual measures and individual actions. I hope that they will be a better combination of norm-based principles on the things like poverty reduction with AI-driven sort of purposes, if we can. I don't see why you can't put those two together. I think what I'm really getting at is trying to reduce human error in something as delicate as aid giving and replacing it with something that simply speeds up the efficiency of aid without reducing the humanity. I know that's a really tall order, and I think this is why the whole complicated conversation that we're having needs to be had now. And it's a really terrific question. So I'll stop there, but thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Anyone want to jump in on that, or we skip to the next question?
Yeah,
Yes,
I
Adam.
can follow up, I think, and then Adam.
Oh,
So
yeah,
do you want to go first, then? Or I can.
No, Alex, you go ahead first. Then.
Yeah, I mean, just to add sort of, a couple of things to what Amelia said. It's a really great question, Fiona. It's an excellent question. Look, I think there are really a number of issues. I mean, one would be very interesting, namely whether aid, for example, would be tied to any human rights obligations within developing countries, and how expansive that's going to be viewed. Whether, for example, the use of technologies by these countries, will be included in such aid agreements. That would be very interesting to see. I think there's also, there's sort of a danger, because you think about developing countries, that we are opening up a double standard in a way, in the way that we view AI, or view some of how some of these technologies are used. In the sense that we say, well, in developing countries, to get your aid, you have to do this, and that, and that's how your AI is going to be regulated. And in a way, then those countries which are more developed, which are more powerful, simply because they're powerful, get away with more. And we have a lovely double standard. I think lastly, the big question which Amelia alluded to partly is global governance, whether there can be a global governance framework really for the use of AI. Now, global governance, there is, much less enthusiasm about it than there was, for example, in the 1990s. So I think we are sort of at a crunch point where we would really need, in a way, kind of more global engagement, more global governance on these technology issues. But exactly the framework we need is under pressure. And that doesn't necessarily fill me with optimism, to be honest, to end on a more skeptical note. Thank you. That's a great question. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could just add to some of these points, the issues about politically supportive AI, or AI that is able to support moral judgments or legal decisions, these issues have really started to penetrate the core of AI research among the people who do formal logic and mathematical models and these kinds of things. And increasingly, there are efforts to build systems that intrinsically have attractive humanistic properties. Believe it or not, that's what people want to do. And they are starting to move in that direction. And one would hope that that's kind of the next phase of AI. It's not simply a matter of saying, we're going to take this machine learning algorithm and apply it, or we've got these nice programming languages like Prolog or whatever it is, of Python, and we can program anything that we want. We will have programming languages and programming frameworks that intrinsically build in the attractive properties that we want. And we really, I think, should put some effort to that, and it will intrinsically take a cooperation between political science and philosophy and sociology and computer scientists to kind of incorporate these concepts into a programmed a framework and an environment.
Okay, next question by Alikan Setskina. So I hope I pronounced it correctly. In a hypothetical scenario where AI managed to extract information from ordinary language and legal system, train with it, analyze and reason based on it, according to these conditions in jury-based legal systems, should we give at least one chair to AI out of 12, for example? Maybe Miklos, you want to pick that?
AI should not be a chair. I mean, there is a function for the jurors. They represent society and common sense. And AI is anything but common sense. You may try, training AI for common sense. You may even try to train a computer to be wise, but they are not. I mean, I think AI is good for certain purposes, and it's a fit for purpose kind of tool. But you have to understand what it's good at, and they are not good at making good judgment, wise judgment. It can't think in context. They're not humans. So it can generate certain score on something, probability, likelihood, can give you additional information. I would probably, I mean, if jurors are really well educated, then I would give them additional scoring to help their decision. But I wouldn't give AI a chair ever, because that's the jury system has a purpose in society, and AI would screw it up. So no, that's at least my take.
Yes, Adam.
But we could use AI as a jury support tool to understand in greater depth what the jurors think and how they compare and contrast across each other and how they came about their decisions. That's a very good use of AI. We have the technology to do that, and that will help us understand how humans think for better decisions. So there's another use for AI other than making it a chair in a jury.
Okay, thank you. That's it for the Q&A. Apologies to Atai for not being able to cover the last question, but
I have.
Yes.
So before we go, thank you, Andrea, for managing the Q&As.
Thank you.
This is the last quick fire question. We have 1 minute left. So if you please give me your prediction about the future, how the future of AI and democracy will look like in 5 years, and how will it look like in 25? Is that a positive future? Is that a negative future? Or is just different? So if you could, all the panelists, if you could say maybe 2 sentences about what the future holds. Is it okay to start with you, Amelia?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm channeling my inner mystic Meg. I reckon it'll be hard at the beginning and then easier later on, because we'll make the mistakes early. So I suppose let's just use local governments very briefly. I can see them unrolling AI and probably tripping up and using it perhaps in not necessarily the right sectors, but hopefully, 10 or 20 years down the road, data experts and substantive experts like lawyers, for example, but also political, legal policy experts in a slightly more holistic use of those expertise will come together, guided by a more technologically astute understanding of simply what the data can do for us, and find those areas where it does make sense to apply them, having made probably those initial mistakes to begin with. So bad, but then hopefully better towards the end. Thanks.
So the profit round now moves on to the next profit around the table. Miklos?
Well, I think if you give the tool, the AI tool, and what AI is capable of, especially if we consider all the developments going on in AI at the moment in the last couple of years, if you just project it to the next 10, it can bring a lot of things. Will it be in good hands or not? That's the big question. I think if we use it carefully and if we put it into right hands, then our lives may be even longer, because use of AI in healthcare. Our decision may be wiser. I can't say that. Maybe more coherent on the longer run. However, if you put it in the wrong hands in certain countries, AI is gonna create countries and governments and systems that make lives much more miserable than we experienced ever on planet Earth.
Alex, what is your prediction for the future?
Yeah, I'm the pessimist, probably because I'm a philosopher. I don't know. I'm a cheerful person, but I'm pessimistic about political matters. Look, I mean, I've worked a long time for most of my academic career on matters relating to armed conflict. That's sort of really my bread and butter. And it seems to me that almost every emerging technology or any new technology has been used for illicit purposes, has been used to abuse human rights, up to the point where you exterminate human individuals. So Emilia was saying it might be quite bad before it gets better. I think there will be very bad experiences. I don't think why AI should be different from any other technology which has been abused for illicit purposes. So we might fall down quite a bit. Hopefully we'll learn from it, but I'm not particularly hopeful, optimistic about the future.
And now to the eternal optimist to finish this round. To Adam.
No, I'm going to join with Alex here. I'm a bit pessimistic, to be frank. I would love to be optimistic. I would love to say that this is going to be wonderful, and the technology will be wonderful. There are going to be fantastic things that we learn about logic, learn about computer science, learn about data, these kinds of things. I don't think the technology is really the issue. It's really a social political issue. And, a great many of the advances that are, we would like to see are being held back for social political reasons and not technological issues. So and the other thing about, computer science and technology is that it has enormous potential to be highly centralized, and it has enormous potential to be extremely opaque, right? And between those two kinds of things, there'll be lots of things going on that are being done by centralized forces for which we have very little indication. And I really worry about that. It's very difficult to see how, the tool in the wrong hands will, be corrected. So I'm leaning a little bit more on the skeptical side of things.
So on that note, which is a negative one, but it's not intended. Possibly it's the way we exist these days, a bit on the negative side. I would like to say thank you to Andrea for managing the Q&As, and to our 4 panelists, Emilia Hetfield, Alex Leveringhouse, Miklos Orban, and Adam Weiner. This is the end of AI for Democracy. This is the end of a discussion of today, but possibly not the end of the discussion on this matter. And we invite you all to follow us on the various sources. This recording will be available on the Festival of Social Science, the Surrey Festival of Social Science website, and we will follow up with a survey about how did you find today's event. So to the panelists, thank you all, and to the attendees, thank you for joining us today.
And thank you, Martin, for organizing all of this on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you all.
And good night, and see you soon at another occasion. Bye.
Bye.